I'd like to start off by saying that the way I normally give talks or even teach is I don't just talk. I have very much a discussion-oriented style in the classroom and in my talks. So if you have a question or if you want to have a comment, just feel free to jump in. If I don't speak, you want to just shout it out. And that would be great. And I think that way you guys can get more out of this too, and I can address some of the more specific concerns rather than going off on some kind of tangent that might be less useful. Okay, so let's see. So what is food is where I wanted to even start at this really basic level. Because what I'm going to suggest to you that what you might think is food might not be what the person next to you thinks is food. Okay? So what a culture considers food, another might see as inedible. So for example, just take a moment in your head and think about what is food to you? What would you consider food? And what is something that is not food? If anybody's brave enough to shout something out, that would be awesome. Yes?
I think haggis is not food.
Great, that's a great example.
Haggis is
Word. Awesome food for some.
I had it in Scotland.
I think fritters are not food.
Yes, and you see my little picture. I saw that in a store. I had to purchase that. But we all know that insects are a major food source for a lot of different peoples around the world, right? And if you might have heard some of the literature questioning how we're going to feed meat to people that are meat eaters, people are suggesting uptake of insects. And in fact, in the United States, it might be in Canada too, some of the groundbreaking restaurants that are kind of on the cutting edge of new food trends and so on are serving insects now. This has become the new thing for adventurous foodies to be eating. So, but this one is very interesting because you can tell it's almost more North American in its flavor range there, which I did get this in North America. So bacon and cheese flavored crickets, right? Yes, which I don't think is something that people are eating in Southeast Asia. But the point here is that when we are working with others from different cultural backgrounds, what we might think is food, we have to actually question our very basic assumptions, right? So when we're giving advice on what might be appropriate foods to eat, we cannot assume that people might consider those to be actually edible foods. Okay? So for example, there's different scholars have defined hierarchies of food. So we've all heard of this, no animal products, no dead animal products, so dairy and eggs would be okay. And it kind of goes on like this. But this scale is very interesting because it talks about some parts of dead animals like steak or burger, all parts of dead animals, that's when you would eat the blood as well, and the tongue, like all of the cow would be consumed, right? All non-human animals would be your next level up, and that would include things like whales and dogs and things that horses that might be taboo for many people in North American dominant society. And then the top category in this one classification is all mammals, which includes humans then too, right? Which is oftentimes a line in the sand for many people. So. But what is food and not food is also interesting because it does shift, right, depending on context. Wartime, of course, is a time period when people will eat things that were considered non-food, and other times it will be shamed, feel shame in eating that. But also in times of economic deprivation or foreign travel or migration, people might end up eating things that they consider to be non-food, right, and would be shamed of eating that. This would include things that would be considered low status foods. So for example, I had colleagues that worked on the northwest coast of North America, and people were clearly eating shellfish in the archaeological record, but people would not admit that in the oral histories or interviews of people just recollecting the way it was. And the reason for that was shellfish was considered to be a low status food, but it was just not something you would admit to eating, right? Which is interesting because for other people, that's actually an expensive food and difficult to get. Right? So this is why it's important to recognize that we actually need to kind of take a step back and really question, like, what is even food? What is this? What people consider food? Others would consider things like I've done this before with college-age students, and it's like Cheetos would be not food for some. They're just like, what is that? It's chemicals, right? So everybody has their ideas of what is food and what is not food. And what we consider to be food or not food has been debated whether how much of it is learned through our sociocultural environments and how much of it can be considered to be biological, or the wisdom of the body telling us what we should be eating. And this is interesting if you consider arguments around our inherent or biological drive for sweet and salty foods. This is, I would argue, something that's kind of dominant in the way people are talking about food right now. This is something that seems to be an evolutionary kind of aspect to our biologies, that all of us have this drive for sweet, salty foods. So maybe that's inherent, but maybe, I mean, we know there are differences between individuals and between cultural groups on this as well, right? So how much of that is learned and how much of it is biological? But we'll keep coming back to that because I just want to emphasize a little more on the cultural aspects of food here. So we have to learn what to eat. So in the process of doing that, we're learning what is food, and also we're learning who can eat this kind of food. All right, so what is food also varies by our life stage. So we have baby foods, right? We have foods that are considered to be okay for children, different life stages, right, during pregnancy and so on. So we have to learn this. There's gendered foods as well in many societies. There are foods that are acceptable for men to eat, and that women should not eat, and vice versa. Okay, and we'll talk more about that as well. But part of learning what to eat too is also related to how we eat, right? So the utensils we use, how do you sit at a table, do you sit on the floor, and so on. Who you sit with, who gets served first. And so perhaps something that may or may not be important in your work is the symbolic nature of food too. So what this means is that food tells us a lot more about social relationships and who people are. So for example, there are certain kinds of foods that would only be given to people that are considered to be high status in the group. So you might be sitting around the table, but only the highest status member will be given that food. My partner is an archaeologist and was working in Siberia, and was invited to sheep sacrifice. I'm going off on a tangent here, I realize that, but bear with me for a second. And this was done, they were doing this to show him the traditional way of sacrificing the sheep. And he describes it as kind of very Indiana Jonesy kind of moment, right? Because there is like the sheep is held by its forelegs on its back. And then literally, like, there's a cut, and then the hand goes right into the heart and pulls it out, right? And so it's a very quick, like, snap of the aorta, very quick death for the sheep, but no blood is lost, which is important because the blood is saved and drained properly and used for other things. But then there's a feast afterwards, and he, being a foreigner and there to learn, was the guest of honor, the high status person in that group. And because of that, he's sitting there. And doesn't have always the strongest, linguistic skills for this group as well. And he's sitting there, and they bring to him the head of the sheep, raw, and with the top of the cranium cut off, right? So the brains are there, so the brains haven't been cooked. And he's sitting there thinking to himself, oh dear. Not wanting to offend, but thinking about it how, and brains are food for a lot of people, right, in different parts of the world, right? Those are different kidneys and liver and so on, right? So, not wanting to offend, but also really not wanting to conceive brains. And so the shaman who, I think, took pity on him, came up and was like, okay, let's go, sacrifice this to the fire, and showed him what to do, and then said, like, don't worry, this is the 21st century, we're not going to force you to eat this, which was really cute, I thought. So he was just like, cute. But that's an example of being the high status person. You're like, other people might have been really wanting that, but it's not possible to have to eat the brains because the high status person. Okay? But this can happen in families as well. So the elders of the family might be higher status. The elder men might be higher status and be served first, or be served certain kinds of food that the women or the younger children might not have access to. Okay, so again, it varies by cultural group, but it's not just culture, it varies by families too. So one really needs to talk to people, because we cannot just stereotype that all people of a particular cultural group are going to behave in this way. Okay, so it makes life a little more complicated for you as well. And then you've probably been aware of this, that there's food taboos. So that certain life stages or certain conditions, people will avoid certain kinds of foods. Okay, and this can be related to religion, but this can also be related to like life stage of pregnancy. There are many different cultures around the world that have different kinds of pregnancy taboos. So foods that you're not supposed to eat while you're pregnant. A lot of times these are meat, eggs, things that we would in America label as high protein kind of foods, but it can be other things too. It can be different kinds of fruits and vegetables. Sometimes because of the symbolic meaning of the food, right? Similarly, there is foods that are taboo during breastfeeding, right? Again, because they try to protect the mother and the baby, but the idea is that these foods could potentially cause harm. If I can just talk more about this if you're interested as well in a minute. And then food as medicine is very much a part of people's lifeways, especially in cultural groups that have humoral medical systems. I don't know if you've heard of this before, but where the bodies seem to need to be in balance. You have like the different humors, or Chinese medicine would be an example of this. Ayurvedic medicine, Unani medicine, the body needs to be in balance, and food is one of the ways that one can maintain balance in their bodies. Okay, so it's an everyday practice of being healthy, and so what you eat and what foods you avoid are directly related to this concept. Are there any questions or comments at this stage?
I'm curious, for example, I'm sure there's a sort of that around patients we might see around here, different groups, things we might not know about people that we're seeing around some of these issues.
Yeah, I have also worked in India, and then my dissertation work was on pregnancy and food practices during pregnancy. And so there's the Unani medicine is like an Islamic medicine. Ayurvedic medicine is thousands of years old traditions there too. And the basic idea is that the body becomes hot during pregnancy. And so because it becomes hot, you want to avoid foods that are hot, because that will increase the heat in the body, and that could cause problems. In particular, it can lead to miscarriage. Okay, so you want to eat foods that are cold foods or cooling foods. Now, when the way foods are labeled, this is not based on temperature or spiciness.
Okay, I was going to say,
Yeah.
is it thermal or?
No, not at all. It's a classification of the foods. So hot foods included meat, but also included things like mango and papaya were considered to be hot foods as well. And then there were cold foods too, like cucumber was considered to be one of the cooling foods. But it's also, it's not a polarized system. It's a rainbow. It's a gradation. So you can have hot foods, you have sort of hot foods, warm foods, neutral, and then the other way down to cold. Okay. So it's a rainbow. And what was interesting too is that when I spoke to women, there were debates about how to classify foods. So I'd be interviewing a woman and her neighbor would pop in, and next thing you know, they're going at it about, really, is this really a hot food or not? But there seemed to be about a dozen foods that people did tend to agree on that were hot, and that included the mango, the papaya, and the meat, and the cold foods. But what is also interesting is this social aspect of food, because the family context is important. So the women that were living in nuclear families, they could kind of stretch the rules a little bit more because there's nobody there to see what they're doing, right? Whereas if there was a mother-in-law in the house, then the mother-in-law would ensure that the rules were being followed, right? So I lived with a family for a while where the daughter-in-law was pregnant, and she, cut up the papaya to serve to everybody, and the mother-in-law, she just stopped her. I was like, I saw it, like, yeah, we're not having any of this, right? Because it's not appropriate, right? So it does vary. But also, this is why I wanted to emphasize that we cannot stereotype cultural groups, because there was individual variation. So talking to some of the women, they were like, I was working in a slaughter settlement, and they were like, well, in other slaughter settlements, there's people that have come from Nepal, for example. And they're like, but they eat rice and they're okay, so why shouldn't I be okay, So they would try it. And many of the women listened to their bodies, right? So if something went wrong, or if they didn't feel good, or might have, for whatever reason, might have started to sweat or have heart palpitations or whatever, they would be like, oh, okay, so maybe I should follow the rules, right? But others, broke the rules and nothing happened to them, so they figured all's good, right?
Is it a blanket, like that you cannot eat it, or does it have to be blended then with cold? Like, can you balance them? Can they do that?
That's a very good question, because there's also rules for breaking rules. To use Carol Matterman's phrase, who worked in Malaysia, and she was in the field, a decade or more before I ever went to the field, and again worked in Malaysia. But she used this phrase, rules for breaking rules, and I saw that too. So mango, for example, women would have ways of, if you soak it in ice water for X long, then you have cooled it enough to make it edible. Right, so that would be an example of ways to try to get around it too. But I guess my point is though that while there are these kind of cultural norms, people don't just follow cultural norms blindly, right? So, and again, that makes it a bit harder than when you need more time then to talk to people, right? To figure out what they think and how they eat and practice and so on. I'm going to move ahead here for I'm going to skip over this, but the only point that I really kind of want to emphasize here for us is the importance of food in creating and maintaining social bonds, right? If this, we talk about this, around family dinners, for example, but for my immigrants, this is also really important, right? Because the foods that they serve in their house are used to transcend those boundaries that stretch across time and space. Right. So, and then what we find is that's very interesting is that immigrants often, if you look at cuisine as an aspect of culture, the way that they cook and the way that they eat might be the way it was when they left, right? And so things have changed back home. So for example, they're making more fast food available. McDonald's is spread globally, kind of thing. The way people are eating has shifted back home, but they're maintaining the way that they ate from the time that they left, so their memories of what it was like. So, and that's really interesting when immigrants go back home and see these changes, and it really speaks to how they have changed. It's an embodied, a bodily knowledge of, oh, I don't quite fit here anymore either, and that can be quite disconcerting for people. So immigrants talk about like not fitting in well in Canada and back home, but they're kind of these living on the boundaries, if you will. So that's really interesting. But let me, in the interest of time here, unless there's any other questions people want to ask about that, kind of go on to thinking about bodies as well. Because just as we think about food, I mean, it's really obvious to us, from the moment we're born, right, we are raised in an environment where we learn what is edible. Similarly, we learn right away how to think about our bodies. And it might seem really obvious to us, and that's what makes it tricky to talk about, right? So, for example, I don't know what happened there with the way we think about our bodies, this is an old drawing that I just used for illustration here about how the astral realm is embodied in the body, so how one particular cultural group saw the body. But this is from North American examples, from research that's been done talking to people who are not medical professionals, but how they understand how the body works. And the scholars have argued that with industrialization, people started to use those kind of ideas to understand how the body works. So it could be like a plumbing concept, like you know, it goes in here and it's just almost like a series of pipes and it comes out there kind of thing, and which is not biologically accurate. And mechanical kinds of metaphors as well. So the body is like a series of gears, and, you know, the industrial kinds of metaphors. But in other cultures, the way the body is conceptualized, and I think this is really fascinating, is that the body seems permeable. So there are cultural groups that, I would argue that here we see the skin as a boundary, right? It separates inside self from outside others, right? But in some cultural groups, there's the skin is transient and the body is permeable. So like someone's shadow passing you, a smell that comes from someone else can get into your body and can lead to illness. This all ties back to being well or ill. So a very, very different understanding of what is the body, right? And how you interact with others, and spirits too come into play here too. The spiritual realm can penetrate that to the body as well. So how we even conceptualize something as basic as the body can differ. Okay. Now, people have also been talking about there can be different kinds of bodies. The individual bodies, arguably, the way most of us think about our bodies, and this is our individual bodies. But what to tie this into food, our bodies are a place where we don't just consume the cultural norms, which is this idea of the site of reflection, but we also resist continuously. Okay? So we are simultaneously taking in, practicing the cultural norms through our bodies, and simultaneously resisting them. Now think about this in terms of body image or gender. Right? So there are, in our society, there are ways to be a woman, to be a man. Right? There are ideal body sizes and shapes that we are supposed to have. We take that in, arguably all of us do in different ways, but we simultaneously resist in different ways too. Does that make sense? If you think about your own lived experiences, how you might accept some things, makeup, some kinds of fashion, but simultaneously resist other things. Yeah, okay, it's mostly nods. Right, so we also can then talk about the social body, and this is, and this really gets down to the body as a symbol of communicating our social place through the body, and then the body politic, which really speaks to the social structures that regulate and control our bodies. Now this is important for us too, because the social structures include the medical system and the educational system, political system, economic system. That's what that means. Okay? And all of this is kind of flowing back and forth into each other simultaneously. Okay? But scholars also talk about other bodies, which I think is also really interesting from a medical practice perspective, and how, and there's been work done on composite bodies about left organ transplant. How does this affect ideas of self if you have part of someone else that gets put into you? The cyborg body. This is an example of let me get the date here, from fall 2013, where this is wearable technology. They've implanted, well, they just say a device here, so that they can monitor their biometric data on a tablet, which is over here. When it's turned on, and they charge this up. So it's like, I can give you the name of the company. This person has a company and they're selling this stuff, and so he's able to monitor fluctuations and notice if he's getting a fever, as well as look back on the recorded data to find patterns he can use to adjust his lifestyle and help keep him healthy. And I just find that really interesting, going back to that kind of idea of embodied knowledge and wisdom of the body. Like, this is relying on technology then to tell us how we feel if we're getting a fever. But people are interested in this, right? We can talk about virtual bodies, like online people create bodies and selves, So I just raised this just as for interest's sake, that how people think about the body actually is much more complex, right? Than thinking about this individual body that's standing or sitting right here, okay? In the literature too, and you're probably aware of this, there's been talk about the medical body and some critique of this reductive gaze on the body. This literature, well, let me tell you what the critique is. People argue that the medical gaze is very much a reductive gaze. It's focusing on one part, a small part of the body, rather than on the person as a whole, and argue that by doing that, it's alienating and it doesn't take into consideration the whole. And by the whole, I mean not just the whole individual, but their social relationships and so on that might be impacting their wellness. Now, I mean, you are all much more experienced in the clinical setting and can speak back to that critique and how much of it is worthy of consideration, how much of it, you all try to address in your daily work. So we can talk about that and move on as you see fit.
I think it gets into this huge divide between tertiary care and primary care. Yeah, you do a referral to the orthopedic surgeon for the right shoulder, and then you need to write a separate referral for the left shoulder, right? So that not being willing to even look at both shoulders, in the same referral. And so that I think that gets into the two solitudes of sort of how you process. Oh, this person's not compliant, they didn't come to my specialty clinic, therefore I'm going to not see them. Right. Is not a really holistic approach, and I would argue in primary care, I think we're much more looking at the whole person.
Right.
And I think that's the entire point of why PCNs have been effective, is because it's a tool to even bring more for people, have more perspective on the same person.
Right.
So I think this gets into that whole siloing and how siloing is very bad for patients.
So specialty care, like in CCU, like if somebody had kidney problems as well, the cardiologist would only deal with the heart.
Right, which is their specialty too.
Yeah.
Like, you need that specialization,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
You see the divide.
Yeah.
Like get somebody else to come in and get that
And I think this speaks this kind of brings it back to a full circle here to these ideas of what is food in the body, right? Because these are holistic ideas, and bringing in family members might be very important because the pregnant women might not have the social status within the family to make the decisions on what foods are bought. The mother-in-law might be the one needs to speak to, or the husband, right? So this kind of taking back to a holistic perspective, I think, is really important for dietary advising, health advising, and so on. But getting to I think what is probably more interest to are this idea of bodily aesthetics. And so all cultures define beautiful bodies. What is a beautiful body? Everybody does this. Okay, this is not unique to us. There has been debate in the literature on whether this is universal or not. And again, people that would argue it's universal are coming at it from a more evolutionary, biological history. There are studies out there that report that a specific waist-hip ratio of 0.7 actually is what is beautiful, and that's it. Symmetry is also another thing. Studies that have measured the symmetry is also defined beauty. Interestingly, I don't know of any kind of waist ratios for men. So this is focused. The researchers have focused on women's bodies in this work, as far as I'm aware of. I would argue that is perhaps needs to be a challenge because there is such cultural variation, right? Even when you look at North American, Euro-American society over time, the shape of what is a beautiful woman has changed dramatically over time and has been modified in different ways, whether it's flattening the chest, taking it, cinching in the waist, and so on with corsets, and so on. There isn't unnecessarily, this was not a 0.7 ratio, right? It was much, much different. Okay, but in defining beautiful bodies, this includes body size and shape, okay, so in different places. There are ideas about what is beautiful, and people modify bodies, to fit those ideals in different ways. So this includes things like dress, right? Could be corsets, right? And we still have Spanx, we still have different things around, right? That kind of, well, not obviously not as badly, but function in a way to make a body look a particular way. Makeup, hairstyles, plastic surgery, foot binding, and some people would argue the shoes we wear, high heels. So that would be an bodily modification. Tattoos, piercings, and some have argued that surgery would be a bodily modification to fit a cultural ideal of beauty. Hang on with the thought, I can see some people going, so just to emphasize, this is just for fun, to emphasize pictures over time of what is a beautiful female body. This was season 8 winner from America's Top Model. Right. This is Ruben's work here, the latest, that's from 1615, most recent picture. So again, it's going back to that kind of evolutionary argument, that quite makes sense because there are such differences in what is beauty over time. And for us, what's interesting too is what is fatness. Okay? So how much fat on the body makes the body beautiful. So this is beauty in 2 different time periods in Euro-American history. So, anthropologists have argued that most societies have valued fatness. And the term fatness here is used on purpose as a non-derogatory term. There is a growth right now, a new field that has opened up called fat studies. This is, path-breakingly new field. And it's kind of a reclamation of the word of fat, taking away the negative aspects of it and trying to make it value less. Right, so we can talk about the fat, as in fat in food, right, and fatness, and fat in bodies. And fat studies scholars have argued that obesity that term is value laden. It's not neutral, right, and there is moral judgment behind that term. Okay, hang on with me. I know this. Just give me a second to try to explain a little bit about why they would argue that. Because they would say that obesity is within well, they would argue that the biomedical system is itself a cultural medical system, right? Just like Ayurvedic, it's just put on par with every other kind of medical system, and that it is influenced by cultural norms of what is healthy, what is beautiful. Again, even the concept of health is culturally defined. Okay. So we can't take that for granted. And so the critics have also noticed how over time the definition of obesity has shifted. And in particular, they highlight the work, I can't remember when this happened, but when the BMI cutoff points shifted, so the overweight shifted downwards. It used to be 27 and went down to 25. You guys are probably all aware of this, exactly when this happened. And so they noticed that suddenly, millions of people became overweight that were overweight the day before. Right? And so they would argue that, that this was an example of how there is cultural elements to these medical definitions. And in terms of that moral judgment behind obesity, this gets into the discrimination of the bias against people who are of larger body size in our society. So you might have heard of people being kicked off planes, or there are studies that do show that people that are of larger body size are less likely to get promoted at work, that there's economic ramifications in people's lives. Similarly, interestingly, on a little tangent, shorter men are less likely to get promoted than taller men do, so height has something to do with this too. But, and the reason there is that discrimination is because of the cultural values that our society puts on fatness. Right? Did you still want to comment on that? I do have more slides.
No, I think you answered my question, but I was gonna make a comment that, you know, it's interesting, and I've always found it interesting is how that shifts too, because when we look at babies and we see a fat little robust baby, we think, how healthy is that baby? But when we see a fat little toddler, we think, you know, and there's some judgment there that, you know, oh, those parents aren't doing right by that child, and culturally, I know my middle son was a fat, very little robust baby, and he was like well over 20 pounds when he was 3 months, and we were down in Louisiana and had to bring him in to emerge, and this very large cultural Louisiana woman had said to me, that baby is so tiny, are you feeding him at all? And I just remember sitting there going, are you kidding me? My arms are breaking here. So it's just that cultural shift.
Right. I mean, we're focusing today on fatness, but there are studies that have shown the same thing for malnourished. So individuals in South Asia is where I'm more familiar with, but where so many of the children are undernourished or malnourished, that's the norm. And that's what's seen as to be a normal size for a 5-year-old, for example, or a 3-year-old or whatever, right? So, and I know, and actually, personally, just as a personal anecdote, I noticed that too. I was so used to seeing the babies there in the slaughter hill that when I came back to North America, I was like, holy crap, these babies are big, you know? Because I was used to like the little 6-pounders.
So how much of it is perception?
And little ones, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's a good example of how your social world influences your perceptions of what is normal. So just kind of building on this meaning of how meanings of fatness have varied across time and place. So it is culturally variable, and in some cultures, you know, some people of larger body size are sexually attractive. So thin people would be seen as unattractive. Very much reverse of, I would argue, of our society, at least our normative ideals here. Okay, so ideas of what is health that you were speaking to, like, you know, they're going to be healthy because they're larger. Happiness and success, too. People of larger body size are happier, too. And interestingly, I would argue in our society we kind of have that, like a lot of, like the comedians, like the joking, you know, like, there's the jolly Saint Nick kind of, you know, idea, right? But life stage is also interesting. In many cultural groups that I've spoken with, and variable from different places around the world, your body's supposed to change, right? So this kind of Hollywood norm, right, of that we have, that again, using that as our cultural norm of beauty, whereas a thin, a youthful-looking body, that doesn't make sense for people from other places, right? So after marriage, for example, if you do not put on weight in India, then they would think, oh, the girl's unhappy. What's wrong with that family? What's going on behind the scenes as a sign of something wrong, right? And other, with women that I've worked with from Latin America, like, you're supposed to gain weight after, not so much after marriage, but after motherhood, for darn sure, right? And you're supposed to, like, get a guitar-shaped body. Was the ideal that was described, right? So this is normal, right? Again, like, so the idea that the body changes over time, I think in our society I would argue that we don't do that, right? Like we on our magazine covers and in the grocery stores, you see how quickly is someone given birth and then back into model for like Heidi Klum. I remember it was 2 months and she was walking the catwalk again, right? So this kind of, and this is seen to be normal now, right? That people are working hard to lose weight after having a baby. The place within the community, so people of higher status would be a larger body size in many places around the world, right? And then the degree. Okay, this is interesting too, because Peter Brown, the anthropologist that did a review of the entire of what the data was available from around the world, argued that what we would call plumpness, for you know, so some fat on the bodies, not our cultural ideal here, is beautiful in most places around the world, which is interesting because it's not the super large bodies. Although there are places where that is the case.
Yeah, I have an alarm.
Like the Azagwa people in Mali, and this book is Rebecca Popeno's an anthropologist, and she lived in this community for at least a year, if I remember right, could have been longer. And she, now her focus was on health. Okay, her focus was on gender and body and food. And what she found here was that fat is sexy and beautiful for women, not for men. So men were thin in this community, by the way we would describe it, but women were, as you saw here in this picture, the larger the better. Okay. So these were sexy, beautiful bodies. Only women of upper social status could achieve those kind of bodies. Okay, so the servants would not have these kind of bodies. It would be the higher status women that would have these bodies. It was seen to bring honor to the family, as I noted here, and it was also the fattening process was seen as a way that the girl becomes a woman too. It was seen as a necessary part of becoming a woman and therefore eligible for marriage. Okay. In the interest of time, I will jump ahead to the fattening process here. So, as you see here, it starts early in girlhood with loss of first 2 baby teeth to start the fattening process. I had talked about the body's and heat and kinds of humoral medical systems. This fattening process, girls' bodies are seen to become hotter as they become fatter and therefore more sexually potent. So they're increasing the heat in their body, they're becoming a womanly body. And because of that, they need to eat specific kinds of food. So they don't get too much heat in their body. You certainly don't want a girl before marriage to be sexually active. Right. So they would eat, the fattening foods are couscous, little balls of couscous, and watery kinds of foods. Typically it was camel's milk with some kind of liquid that was seen as necessary to spread that food throughout the entire body, to get it to all body parts. So, and this is not a fun process, right? So they're not eating like, McDonald's, well, they wouldn't have McDonald's, but curries or any other the food that the rest of the family's eating, right? It really is primarily cow's milk now, I guess camel's milk, and couscous, right? And you eat until, this, again, it's not fun, right? These girls are not wanting to keep eating, they're being made to keep eating, okay? And I think that's really interesting to compare it to dieting in our society, with what girls are undergoing, right? Again, it's, and interestingly, it's the grandmothers that usually supervise this, not the mothers. The process of pursuing that. So there's crying involved, tantrums, things happen, but the grandmas are the ones that make sure that they follow the rules here so that they will eventually have these bodies that will make them eligible for marriage. Also, the girls that this ideally might have a harder time finding a husband, those are girls that their own father has passed away, if they're not as pretty, or if they have marginal social standing, then they will do this to try to increase their social standing to get a better guy. So again, I'm thinking about this in relation to dieting here. I just think it's so fascinating because again, it's not a fun process, right? It's seen as work. It's seen as work by the women too. But and they work hard to conserve the fat that they do gain, so they don't move around a lot necessarily, right? Stretch marks are beautiful too, and so they will do everything they can to increase stretch marks, including like running a comb across the, stretch marks on the arms are beautiful. So running a comb along here to kind of accent them and bring them out too. A very, very interesting example compared to our society in many ways. Questions? I know we only have 15.
So where was that?
This would be like Mali in northwestern part of Africa. And interesting, I have seen WHO charts, and that area of the world is marked red for morbidly obese. As in, again, I told you, it's gendered. And interestingly, there is social change happening too. So, girls that are given choice, there are girls that have put on the weight for marriage and then hit the gym after, as different kinds of bodily beauty norms become spread around the world.
I have a comment and a question. I did have a patient come in wanting medication to make them fatter. And apparently you can purchase medications in that part of the world specifically for the purpose of making you fatter. I have had patients come in wanting that here. And then the other question I have though is when you look at sort of the Middle East, there's this dichotomy between malnourishment in children and obesity in moms. And I had thought that that was more to do with malnourishment in terms of like micronutrients and a drive to eat. So even though you're obese, it's actually not a sign of health or being actually well fed. It's sort of this, I was thinking it was more of this compensatory mechanism, but I'm now wondering if some of this other stuff is coming into play because the children are malnourished micronutrient wise and the moms are obese. And you know, certainly I'm curious just in terms of thinking about clinical practice here, if we want to sort of culturally appropriately counsel people, if we have people from away, if we have people from the Middle East, or if we have people from Africa, and you're concerned, like I have a family that's from Africa, the entire family are my patients, and they all have type 2 diabetes. And so how you go there?
I would go back to the basics, like what is food, like what people are eating and how do they think about their bodies and what's normal. And so, yeah, that is a challenge. One other thing I want to mention before, I didn't have this on the slides, but a number of studies from around the world have talked about what is child feeding practices. So in some, arguably here, we very much focus on the parents, right? We're packing lunch for children well into their teens, oftentimes. You know, it's not the case for everybody, but you know, there's supervision of food, right? But in some places around the world, the children are, you know, as soon as, you know, they're old enough to reach stuff. So, you know, 5-year-old, they're seen as, you know, being able to take care of themselves, right? They'll eat if they're hungry, and they'll eat whatever is around and they can grab. So that could be part of it too. Make it even more complicated for you. So it's like how are the children even feeding themselves, right? Like is it, you know, are they seen to just snack on whatever it is they want to grab from that moment? And then depending on what foods are available here now, there's been a shift to cookies and things like that too.
It's interesting, I know in some of the families I work with, some of the East Indian families, that the children refuse to eat any traditional food. So they won't eat any curry, they won't eat any dal. They just want to eat North American food, and yet the parents are very strict vegetarian, and there's just that conflict.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's certainly a lot about that too, and I think there needs to be a real effort to emphasize the value of traditional cuisines. And I think in the States, right, actually there's an FDA there that is actually trying to get people to eat ethnic food again, you know, because for health reasons, it's a public health message, right? But that's actually a very interesting, ongoing, decades-long process, right, of new immigrants from wherever they are in the world, and the children, often it is the children who want to fit in, right, and they're pushing to eat like their friends are at school, particularly at that age. So there's more going on there too. I think it's about identity, food identity, who one is, right, and how they want to work, who they are. And interestingly enough too, in higher socioeconomic brackets around the city, you might see greater diversity in kids' lunches. Again, going to the foodies and adventurous eaters that are oftentimes associated with people that have the money to spend on getting these different kinds of foods and trying these different kinds of food. So it very much is also a class issue too, as well as an ethnocultural issue.
And that too can change over time, you know.
Absolutely.
My father-in-law always told the story of how he would throw his lobster sandwiches in the ditch on the way to school because didn't want to be seen as poor, and they couldn't afford peanut butter.
Yeah, absolutely. And now, I mean, I look back and I was lucky that I grew up on my ethnic food, right? But yeah, at the time, it's just like, you know, it smells different, it looks different, you know, like kind of, yeah, as a kid, kind of, you know, it was a pretty strong, I think, to be resisting the other kids' judgment and so on. Right? And lunches do get judged, right? They get judged by the teachers or the lunch supervisors as well. It's in a very interesting article written by Ann Allison, who was an American. I think her spouse might have been Japanese. They were in Japan, so she didn't go there for this research, but she ended up writing up this research based on her experiences as a mother and having to pack her child's lunch and talking about the judgment and moralizing that went into, you know, and so, you know, Japanese lunches, the bento boxes can be, women spent hours making these lunches. Have you seen them, right? They're very creative and stuff. And she talks about being like, you know, trying to fit in, and the judgment that goes into what is in that box. And literally the hours that mothers must be putting into the night before to prepare these elaborate, aesthetically pleasing, not just nutritious. You know. And for me, well, I think for me, when I read that article, which is a bit older now, but it's a very, very well-known one that's used in all kinds of you know, textbooks and stuff for students. But for me, it's really interesting to compare that to Martha Stewart. Have you seen like some of the programs, you know, Fever Baby lunches, and you decorate them because you have the time to do so. And I don't mean to put down anybody that does decorate their lunches, but I'm kind of like with you. It's just like, hurry up at the door. It's just
happy to be under napkin.
Yeah. But
I cried when the school went no peanut butter. Okay, so.
Yeah. So, but there's judgment in these lunches, right? And this is something to think about if you do work in schools, right? Because what if the child doesn't have, if the parents don't have as much money to buy fresh fruit and vegetables, and you know, there's this big push to have healthy lunches, different colored fresh food in there, right? Or the judgment that happens in perhaps in higher income schools where, you know, there's processed food in the, rather than, you know, your avocado and, I have seen these lunches, avocado and crackers and cheese that are nicely sliced and prepared for the child ahead of time and so on, right? So this moralizing, perhaps we don't remember or realize how it's happening, but it's happening every day for us. Like in grocery store lines too, we've probably all experienced that. Like setting in line with somebody looking at our stuff, or us looking at someone else's stuff and thinking, huh?
I'm just curious to know if anybody's noticed any of this in terms of your work. One of the things that's come to my attention recently among these young med students is that some of them live home until they are finished residency. And there is someone who takes care of everything of their life until they are done. Their only task is to study. And if they do not succeed, they will let down the family and will be disowned. And everything is done for them. And then this transition of all of a sudden you actually have to run a household and you have no idea what you're doing. And it's interesting because some of this, I think it's tied into a whole lot of other things other than food, in terms of expectations and role and what you're going to do. And I'm just curious if people have come up with that, any of that kind of thing in your work. Like, have you seen that kind of thing?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so how do we build skills capacity when people have gone through their entire formative years not actually learning any of the skills of how to...
Yeah, and then there's that huge life transition stress when it does happen.
It's even in lower income families because if you have two parents that are working or a parent that's working multiple jobs, they don't have time to teach their children how to cook. They just get food on the table in any way they can, whether that's pizza or a frozen dinner. And so they grow up not having any skills aside from being able to push buttons on the microwave. And so trying to teach some skill around food or there just is no skill there. So it's on both sides. And I would say in schools, I noticed, and this was a thing I was involved with a couple of years ago, we were doing a hot lunch program for a neighborhood in a higher end area of Edmonton. And so part of the hot lunch was to try and move from the traditional pizza and hot dog lunches to doing soups. and getting all of the children involved in cutting vegetables and making these soups. And parents were up in arms. Like, they were on a war path because Johnny doesn't eat celery. And you're putting celery, you're putting zucchini in a soup. Oh, he hates zucchini. He's not going to eat the soup. And parents, like I can tell you, 30 parents each month complained, and yet every child ate that soup because they were invested in, they cut it, they talked about the vegetables, they talked about where they grew them, like, and yet it was the parents that were the issue, it wasn't the child. It was really interesting. Yet in this particular school, children are shunned if they bring processed food to school. So it has to be, it's not the bento box, but it has to be super healthy, highly unprocessed food. So it's changing. In some of the schools I find, yeah, the parents are very focused on health, and if a child has a cookie in their lunch, that is not a good way. I don't know if anybody else has noticed that. You need to send your child to revenge.
Well, the Newton Public School Board actually put out that kids aren't supposed to be bringing sweet stuff in their lunch. They're not supposed to have chips and chocolate bars and things like that in their lunches, but it's still happening. Nobody enforces it. So then the moms that do say, no, you can't have that in your lunch, my kids are coming home and saying, oh, well, so-and-so gets a chocolate bar every day, how come I don't get anything?
And I know one,
they're not actually supposed to be bringing that stuff.
yeah. And I know a mom who got a letter home saying, with the cookie attached to the letter, and saying, you cannot send that to school.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because that's policing, right? That's policing food, but we police, right? Through a society, we do this, right? And it can be through power figures, like the principal sending something home, but all of us in our positions can do this too, right? Because we're in a position where we could be judging, right? So, so thinking about policing fat bodies was also good to mention, like, even in clothing stores, right? This happens in multiple levels. Like, do you fit the sizes with the ready-made wear that's there, right? This kind of thing they're all ways of policing fat bodies, and again, our critical obesity researchers, fat studies researchers would argue that even BMI measures are a way of policing bodies. Okay? I know my time is just about up, so I'm going to skip over this and raise, and I'm sure you guys already are well aware of this, but instead of that policing fat bodies, they would argue going for health at any size or every size, right? So rather than it being about BMI, it just needs more time then, right? It needs, the blood work to be done, the other kinds of tests that you guys are all aware of to challenge that equation that weight equals health. And in terms of the stigma that's associated with this is, again, a major social issue, right? Like I mentioned the airplanes. Remember that fellow that was turned away from Southwest Airlines a flight of, a year or so ago? So the health at every size, I just summarized 3 main points there of what that approach does, and what it needs also to do is to take the focus away from the individual, right, and focusing on the world around them. So time is a big issue, right? We mentioned time here already, but the time to cook, the time to purchase food, right, the time to prepare food, the time to exercise or take care of oneself, right? All of this, and there's kind of different kinds of social constraints in our time. And then just as a final note here, let's go a minute over, are again, remember the cultural variations and ideas on what is a healthy, attractive body, and that these within a culture also vary by age, gender, and so on, right? So there's not necessarily a uniform definition. So I'll leave it on that note. Jody, I just wanted to ask if the handouts of the...
Yes.
Yeah.
So everyone has those.
Okay, so on these handouts, there's some in your time if you're so interested to see some more. The articles, I obviously didn't write, I just have a short form there, so that the journal name is there, and the volume number, the date. I don't have the titles listed down, but they're not all around fat studies. There are stuff around food, around body, and then some around obesity or fat studies. Okay, I'm just going to draw your attention to one in particular by a book. The very first one on the book, Kulik and Medley, who are editors, Fat, the Anthropology of an Obsession. that book, I have it here if anybody's interested in taking a quick peek on it. I just brought it to your attention because it's very readable. So it's not written in academic style. Rebecca Popenow, for example, has a chapter in here, but it's an extremely readable piece of work. So it's not scholarly in this writing. And there are also some art chapters in here for fat activists too that might provide some interesting reading as well. So thank you for inviting me, and I hope I've addressed some of the issues that are concerned to you.
Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, and then we'll take a few minutes break before we do learning topics. Does anybody have anything that was sort of tweaked for you, or things were questions about practical application? I have one. I have many. I have one. The one that I struggle with is when I worked in the north, in these little communities, and then you go to the northern store, and a head of lettuce is $8. And we had in Sandy Lake, we had kids that were 4 years old with diabetes, type 2 diabetes. You're trying to do culturally appropriate interventions because this is a major pressing public health concern. And the access to the foods, we try to do some counseling around traditional foods, like eat the fish, not the duck, whatever. We didn't really know what we were doing. And I'm just curious if, no, seriously, I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, you're sitting there and you have all these patients with diabetes, most of the community, there's genetic mutations for diabetes. Their entire previous history was nomadic. Like in the past, they had their winter camp and they had their summer camp, and they did a ton of work, and there was a lot of hunting, and it was living off the lands, and there was times when you were in famine. So in a relatively short period of time, everything has changed in those communities with huge impacts on health. And I guess my question is, if you can answer this in 30 seconds, do you have a resource? But my question is, how do we, if you had 2 pearls around some of this, and then some practical things that you could do to try to even open up the conversation so you could even begin to understand what's going on, how would you approach it?
In up north.
Yeah, well, with First Nations.
With First Nations, okay, because I think up north is a whole different ballgame because of
down here.
yeah, absolutely been down here. But starting to learn about what the traditional foodways are would be an obvious starting point. Because you're right, there wasn't much veggies. I mean, I think it was if I remember right, it's the inside of the stomach would be eaten, would be gotten some nutrients that way, the fish, the blubber, and so on. And interestingly, I just saw an article about the Neanderthals. Also, the diabetes gene might have come from Neanderthals, so it's lived in a similar kind of climate in humans. So it's some really interesting work there. And then the political activism to on subsidizing the food that gets up to the north, right? Working with communities, with elders, and younger folks on preparing food, because this is not part of one's cultural heritage. Some people are just never going to eat salad. So maybe there's another way to think about how to incorporate vegetables and fresh cooking vegetables and so on. And we all know that if their vegetables are old, as they might be getting transported that distance, they're not palatable. All right, so maybe maybe frozen vegetables might be maybe that'd be one way to deal with costs too. Think about cooking soups, something that would be more appropriate rather than fresh salads. I've had students from up north who talk about of different ethnic backgrounds who talk about how awful the food is, and not just expensive, but the fresh food. It just doesn't look good. It doesn't taste good. That would be my advice on how to start. Because I think what's happened, my understanding, not that I've been up north, my understanding is that people have gone to there's fried food or there's high fat, highly processed food or easy food like that people are turning to. I did work with colleagues in James Bay Cree, which is not West Farmland, but it was and the interesting thing there is that for the young women, the young mothers, the issue was timing, and it was so many of the same constraints that we all face every day, right? You're working, you know, you need the processed food because you don't have the time to chop this stuff. So, you know, creating more processed food alternatives, perhaps, you know, like spaces that are ready to go ahead of time, and providing people collaborative community kitchens are also a very common thing across different cultures. Oftentimes it's for around special events, but perhaps, you know, having something not just occasionally, but a weekly thing where you prepare stuff and freeze it for. I mean, we have that as businesses now, right? Starting here, Simply Supper and others around town that, you know, where people are trying to get good food, but also address the lack of time that they actually face in their everyday lives. So like brainstorming about what, but I think key there is working with the community, right? So, you know, what works, what people want to see, and then bringing suggestions and helping make it happen would be, as an outsider, that I would see my possible role being.
Well, the young people don't. I worked in Nunavut for a number of years with the Inuit people, and the young people were getting away from, you know, sure, we'd have our feasts and they'd have their raw charred caribou and what have you, but the young people, they want the pork chops or they want the processed hamburgers from McDonald's that they heat up in the northern store, and it's a smell I can still smell. It's not nice. And so they're not wanting to go back to the traditional. And it is very expensive. When you bring your lettuce and tomatoes home from the store, you have to keep it inside your parka so it doesn't freeze. Peppers are $17 a kilo, and that was 10 years ago.
And I think coming into a culture like that and expecting them to eat our way, our definition of healthy, is they see these other people coming in and they go, I don't want to hear what you have to say, because you're telling I should eat bananas and papayas and fruit, and that's not part of their culture. And so really finding things to transfer between what they have traditionally done, some of the health pieces, and looking at what they're currently doing and making subtle shifts, but not saying maybe lettuce is not something probably practical that the community can eat on a regular basis.
But when you walk into the store, the first thing you see is the cans of Coke. And if they run out from when the barge order, they will spend $5 for a can. So you see they've got 6 cans of Coke and 5 packages of Judgement soup. That's what they're buying, which costs a lot.
Thanks, Michelle.